I think, Erin, it's really not an exaggeration to say that you have really brought our thinking on in terms of translanguaging and communicative repertoires. I think really your engagement with your work has really made us step back, background language, background linguistics, and think about the body and embodied communication. And that theoretical line has been tremendously important in both mine and Adrian's work, but also your work on ethnography and linguistic ethnography and methodology has also been tremendously important. And I was going to, I think I probably still use the word learning there, that I have learned from you ever since, but I really don't want to use that now, Gerd. And I really want to say I have been touched by your work. And I actually think that is a much better description. I have been touched by your work and disarmed by your work. And I think those words are really useful and important to use for me in introducing you here. So over to you, Erin, for your perspectives. Thank you very much, and we'll come back at the end. I'll background myself now, and we look forward to listening to you. So please share your screen now whenever you're ready.
Okay, I will. Thank you very much. And thanks for that lovely introduction. It's really quite warming for me to be introduced that way, especially with everybody here, and just, you know, the level of work, it's impactful on me, what you're all doing. You can see from behind me, I mean, quite a lot of these is your work. So it's really valuable for me to be able to input my thoughts and feelings on an event such like this. So I'll start with a brief wind up and a kind of summary, I suppose, of some of the main things we've discussed today and have discussed generally throughout the whole of Ether. I'll just do that now in terms of sharing my PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint okay. So I just want to explain that I'm starting this introduction with really my own personal experience of living here in Washington, DC. I've lived here for the last 20 years, and when I live in DC, we live really right next to Capitol Hill, right next to the Capitol, where all the riots were happening. We could see everything from our house window. And you know what it looked like, and you know what that's meant over the last 2 years, you know, at the end of the Trump presidency, and what's happened in DC and its descendants into martial law almost. So I think about my own experiences very much in terms of public spaces, the discourses I have with my neighbors, how I interact, how I encounter, how I adapt my encounters. And with that frame, I'd like to touch on a number of different themes that I believe have come up across the sessions today. Who has the rights to be in specific situations and locations, how art can inhabit and capture spaces, and how music can also express encounters in public life and in those spaces. All the photos in the presentation I took myself, just so that you know. They're not always nice, not always nice as the first one, just so you know. So first of all, I wanted to think about something that recurred as a theme today, is how do we really listen to people who are strangers to us? And I feel like there's almost a converse theme of, you know, what's the ethics of listening? What's the morality of representing others, and especially strangers? And what does it mean to interpret or translate for them? Sometimes I should just make it easy and not be too fancy with PowerPoint. It's the case in point. But look, what I mean to talk about is, you know, if we're talking about what does it mean to translate or be translated, what does it mean to interpret or to be interpreted? Okay, and looking at the duality of those, and really understanding that translation is more out of time. It's asynchronous. It's usually linked traditionally with literature or screen studies, those sorts of things. Interpretation being much more in the moment, in the now, the transformative encounter. Yeah. So I wanted really to hold those thoughts, and then to think about what it means to then have all the different encounters that we've discussed today. And in these encounters, where and when people have different trajectories, different biographies and understandings, what happens when those come together? And really the point being is that COVID has disrupted massively our thinking and our experiences in this way. And I want to explain this photo a little bit to you in order to do that. A couple of years ago, just when the COVID pandemic started, and we're very limited in where we could go. And I used to travel a great deal. I used to travel over to the UK a lot. I worked at Gallaudet University, and all of a sudden, like everybody, we're in lockdown. So, you're looking at things much more close up. You're inspecting the everyday, the proximal, the nearby, the neighborhood, far more, as we all did, as opposed to the wider world. And in walking around my own neighborhood, I started to see and notice the different ways that people were interacting and having encounters that were non-traditional. There was a street nearby where every day the message would change. And here's one of the messages that were written out with these little plastic letters on this wall. And every day there was a new little bon mot or a message, really. And I thought it was fascinating, where I walked and I thought, well, okay, are they doing this to me? Are they sharing it with the world? Am I sharing it with them? Is it co-constructed? Is it an encounter? Even if I haven't even seen the person, I don't know what they look like. What's going on? Their presence is there, and the communication is residual. There's an artifact of it still there. And you can see some more. As I said, the message has changed every day. So just as evidence of that, you can see sometimes it would be just something simple about the weather. Occasionally, a little bit philosophical. They talk about International AIDS Day or Women's Day, those sorts of things. If you look closer, there's actually little frogs and animals and all sorts of stuff in the greenery as well. And I thought it was a really interesting way of communicating, of engaging, of interacting. And the person was never there. Yeah. But their presence, their aura, I guess, their being in some way is still at this place of encounter. And I found that interesting. And this morning, certainly we saw different styles of provocations, theoretical, methodological, and of course, practical. I think today we could also see how there are different ways of looking back on these events and of recording them. I mean, recording being an obvious one. We're recording today, there's captions, there's note-taking, there's all those things going on today. And it makes you think about how you then capture the other's voice, the other's view. Is it, through recording, field notes, all those different methods. And we're clearly becoming quite introspective about how those things are created and the different ways in which they're created. And today I just want to talk about contact zones a little bit, because I think, there's a real strong metaphorical change into what safe space means because of COVID and the pandemic. So can unsafe spaces be productive is a question that we have to ask ourselves and look at ourselves, what does our discomfort tell us? Is there something to be learned? And the photo is of a sticker just put on a lamppost on a street nearby. Somebody just put it of their own volition, their own accord. And I thought it was an interesting philosophical stance. This person creates this sticker, and you think, well, is it a way of this person's interaction with the virus? Are they saying that they want to give the virus? It's a very weird thing that I think. And this person has touched something in a public space at the point in time whereby encounters were unsafe. Yeah, and it triggered me, and it just started me thinking about these messages from strangers to strangers, to take care of yourself. Okay, so we'll now move on to what happened in DC. These are photos of my neighborhoods, and I was talking a little bit about public spaces in DC and how those public spaces were radically transformed, and encounters became incredibly different as a result of tumultuous events on the Capitol. And I remember one day when I was walking, I saw a person being, this kind of powerful silence. Yeah, a presenter was talking about, one of the presenters today talks about the power of silence, and I saw this woman. She was a protester. The top left picture of the former president, I'll just point out. So the photo's from 2020, just before he went over, and she's dressed in the garb that's supposed to be redolent of the book and the television series The Handmaid's Tale. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. So you can see that that's what she's dressed as, this very lonely figure in a very quiet, silent landscape, and in silent protest. I didn't try and talk to her. Well, I mean, I'm deaf, but I mean, beside that, I looked at her presence, and I still encountered her in silence, and I became witness to her protest in that moment. The photograph below it is again of Capitol, the Capitol building, and as I'm sure you're well aware of the many things that happened under the former president, DC became a very different city. More fences, more barriers, and these old trucks used to block roadways in a very intimidating way. So my encounter with the place, with public places and spaces, became radically different, because many of the places ceased to be public spaces. They certainly were. There were concourses and avenues where you could walk around the Capitol. You could freely walk into many buildings, encounter people who were making the laws of the land. But for a long while, the police, the fences, the security, the ever-present helicopters overhead gave a very different feeling about these encounters going on in so-called public spaces. And they became more fraught with a great many perils and dangers. So, when we're thinking of encounters in space and time, but in what form are these happening, these co-present encounters, and what shifts can we now talk about? Going back to the presentation about architecture this morning, you can see the power of architecture. I mean, from these photos, obviously, these are the DC government buildings. It's quite clear how the buildings are also silent witness to the comings and goings of human beings in front of them. And the bottom left, you can see the alleyway, which is my actual alleyway behind my house, and you find in those landscapes surprising things. So there's cats, and you can see the Erin signals breaking down a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm just going to have to ask her to go back a little bit. Okay, so in talking about the alley, the point I wanted to make there was, it's a much more personal encounter, a much more intimate type of encounter. Because, well, first of all, I'm walking through my own neighborhood, but I'm seeing artwork from that I've never seen before, from a person that I don't know, about the subject being a cat. And I was just thinking that in terms of, again, today we've talked about lots of different spaces and how encounters occur in those different settings and genres of spaces. And when we think about silence transforming into something else, you know, cacophony, something else, to see how people express their anger, and especially after George Floyd was murdered, to see what happened in public spaces at this time. So many people, as I'm sure you're aware, protested in public spaces, took over those spaces in response to the killing. The graffiti and street art was used very much as a form of communication and protest and encounter. So I really wanted to think about how we've envisaged encounters and how our understanding has shifted and evolved over time. I'd like to move on to talk about another theme that came up quite a lot today. The third main theme is this becoming the other. So thinking about musicians, and sign language interpreters, and deaf people, and this kind of those kinds of interfaces, if you like, and the tensions that go alongside such encounters. For groups of people who come together through protest, often we see groups of strangers coming together, such as after the George Floyd killing. You see movements of people that don't know each other coming together in unison. So now I want to look at something different, where we're looking at, as I've said, where we think about musicians, sign language interpreters, and deaf people, and using that as a case study or as an example to touch on a number of different themes that came up throughout the provocations this morning. And as I said, that's the tensions and the ethics of speaking for other people. Obviously, it's very interesting for me personally, that's clear. I was born deaf, I've grown up deaf, I'm a sign language user, it's my first language, American Sign Language. And, you know, to see other people talk about my potential to enjoy music, you can see it's problematic. It's a bit different. It's not in a bad way, it's not in a negative way. There's value in these debates and in these discourses in public, of course, but because I'm also a deaf anthropologist, what that means is that, I'm talking about the other in my work, and the other is me, in a sense. And my PhD research looked at deaf people in Cambodia. So I do still have that experience of the other. I'm there. Certainly, I can't represent deaf Cambodians because I have a very different positionality from them. I'm a white, deaf woman with all the privileges that come with having an American passport and an American education. So there you go. So again, of course, this is where you have to work despite your own comfort levels, at introspection, at reflexivity, and I was a little uncomfortable with how many people would congratulate interpreters there and in many other situations. And sometimes it becomes more about the interpreters or the people that are the mediators, the go-betweens, more than the actual people themselves. And I think that's problematic. And it's important that we look at those tensions and consider those tensions in such encounters. I'm the first to be very praiseworthy when I'm happy with interpreting services. It's incredibly hard work. And the skill that Amber brings to what she does is amazing in those musical performances, and the work she does is incredibly valuable. Of that, there's no doubt. But at the same time, it's good to look at the tensions that exist, because if deaf people aren't there, what's going on? Who's the interpretation for? And these are good, I think, provocations for all of us. All of us can think about our own positionalities with our own research interests and research questions, I'm sure, of a case study such as this, where you've been the other, or whether you've been a storyteller, or you've, like me, you've inhabited a number of these different roles in these situations, in these settings. And one particular liner that came across to me, I think it was Charles Forstick that talked about in their provocation. That was a very interesting one about the aesthetics of disappearance and erasure, if I got that right. So And that, I think, applies to a great many different settings and aspects of what we're looking at. For example, should interpreters be disappeared so only the deaf person is visible, right? Okay, well, hang on. At the same time, interpreters by sign language interpreters by their very nature are visible, so you can't get over that. So, but at the moment now it's me, isn't it? I've got the camera's focused on me. So what's interesting about this is to somebody was saying, oh, it's the first time, I think the keynote was saying, or Charles, somebody was saying, I see the interpreters in front of me rather than beside of me. That very change in the aesthetics of the setting are clearly having an effect on people. Sign language is a very visually interesting thing. People are very expressive when they're using it. It's a totally different way of communicating. And of course, it's fascinating to most people. It might sound weird. I mean, I've got a Scottish accent, right? A Scottish male accent, and here I am, a white American woman. And I guess some people find that discombobulating. I don't know if Andy's trying to sound any more American or any less Scottish. I've got no idea. So I think that this point is really important for us to consider, isn't it? What this means on a deeper level. And I was really struck by some of the discussions amongst the musicians this morning. There was some really beautiful points being made there, and really powerful for me. It doesn't matter that I'm a deaf person. I enjoy music. I don't know the words. I just like the feel of it. I do like it. I like the vibration of it. Obviously lyrics don't mean anything to me. So I experience music in a very different way. But it got me to thinking that what the other ways of, I think, you have to forgive me, somebody else was saying that music is the translation of the soul, yeah? You're putting feelings into sonic vibrations, yeah? And I wanted to just kind of turn that on its head a little bit and show you some examples of visual music. Now it's silent, but for me and my body, this video is from Bali, where I did my latest field work. And I was looking at this and I just thought there's something intrinsically beautiful to the rhythm of this. So there's something that transcends, just what's going on really, the different sounds, the vibrations, what's happening in reality in terms of the natural world. There's something that's above it. Okay, and so that's just from out here, yeah, in my backyard. So I'm sure you can hear when trees rustle in the wind like that and have a different experience. But obviously, from my point of view as a visual-centered person, to me, this is what I would say is visual music. Now, another example of visual music is this. And I don't know if you're going to get this, but there are two interpreters there, okay? So one is a hearing interpreter, one's a deaf interpreter, and this is a disability group for, I think it was a protest. You see people in wheelchairs and deaf people and all this sort of stuff. But again, strangers coming together, all for a common purpose, and all being angry about what happened with George Floyd and the killing of George Floyd. So have a look at this in terms of the music of encounter. So the sounding GF, George Floyd. So it's a commemoration of his name in sign language is what's going on. So there's a real rhythm to this visual protest. Okay. Okay, so look, just to take all that, it's just really my way of trying to bring everything together. And I don't know how successful I've been, but really my key point is this productive discomfort. I think that's my main takeaway from all of this. So I think I'm not going to read exhaustively from the slide. I think you can read for yourself how I've summarized, I think, the main points that people have raised today that speak to this productive discomfort. So I'll give you a moment just to read that. Okay. If anybody is blind or has a visual impairment, please do just flag it up, and Andy will just read this slide if that's the case. Okay, so I'll share my PowerPoint if you want them as takeaways. So. And I really hope, and I know that the aim of Ether is to generate new questions. I think it's very successful. And I think that some of the things that have come out of the conversations that we've had today are on this slide, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was, you managed to give us so many points to think about, and indeed I would like to pick up on some of the things that you said, particularly around destabilizing identity, but just for a moment, I also want to say that it was very generous of you to go through each of the provocations and make connections across them for us. So thank you very much for really engaging so deeply with everything that you've heard today, but also prepared for beforehand.